Hello and welcome to Upstack America's Oracle EBS Financials Functional Training. My name is Bob and I'm the lead senior consultant for Upstack America. And with me today I have Victor, who is also a senior consultant. And today we are handling lesson 7 of the SLA. And Victor, please walk us through.
Thank you for the introduction, Bob, and welcome everybody to this lesson in our Financials Functional Training series. We are still looking at SLA in this session, and the concept that I want us to cover in this lesson is we are going to look at transaction and accounting chart of accounts. So yesterday we did our first foray into the SLA module on the instance, and if you are paying attention, maybe you would have noticed on those SLA pages, or even as you're doing your own setup, there's some fields that say transaction and accounting chart of accounts. So maybe let's go there quickly and take a look at what I am saying before we discuss this concept. So let me just go to maybe subledger accounting methods. Even on this find window, just take a look at this transaction and accounting. Okay, so let's find, these are the subledger accounting methods. You can see transaction, chart of accounts, transaction, and accounting. If we go to our method, which we have been looking at, the standard accrual, which is associated with a Mascani ledger, you can also see it says transaction and accounting chart of accounts. Okay, if you select application accounting definition and go into one of them, transaction and accounting chart of accounts, go into your journal line definition, for example, the one associated with the event class invoices or any other chart of accounts, transaction and accounting. Look at your line type, chart of accounts, transaction chart of account, you can specify there. So you get the drift. There's these fields whereby you can enter the transaction chart of accounts and accounting chart of accounts. So we are going to see what this means and what is the difference. Of course, when we were doing our ledger setup, there's nowhere where we had to specify a kind of chart of account, or a place where we had to say transaction chart of account or accounting chart of account. So where does this come from? That is what we are going to look at, and we are going to discuss the implications of these two kinds of chart of accounts. All right. All right. We're going to look at this slide of ours that we have decided to make our close companion that shows how these components are related. But in order to understand this concept of accounting and transaction chart of accounts, we have to go back to secondary ledgers. But even before we do that, let's just remind ourselves of how all this SLA module works. All right. So the SLA module, what does it do? It creates accounting for your subledger modules, and that accounting information is sent as journals to your general ledger, and then you can run reports from your general ledger. Okay, so the setup is that at a certain operating unit, there are subledger modules that are being used. For example, account payables, account receivables. Okay, these modules are used to enter subledger transactions, AP for the P2P transactions, AR for your O2C transactions. All right. Once those transactions are entered there at a certain period, or however the company is conducting their business, they create accounting which is sent to your ledgers. All right. Your operating units are usually associated with your primary ledger, which is your, we can see, which is your main ledger. All right. So that's by default. There's this actually profile option called GL ledger name. I'm pretty sure we mentioned it, or if we haven't, we are mentioning it right now, whereby it is used to associate your subledger modules with the ledger to which they are going to be sending this accounting information. Okay. Now, in your subledger modules, when you're entering transactions, in the places where you have to enter accounts, the chart of accounts that you see there is the one that is associated with your primary ledger, correct? So for example, when you have been entering invoices and we have to enter the distribution account, we usually see the values that are associated. We usually see the values for our chart of accounts, the one that we know, the one we created when we were creating our primary ledger. Okay. So the chart of accounts at the operating unit or these subledger modules is the same for is the same as the one that is associated with your primary ledger. So in that case, we can say that by saying that we have said that transactions are entered here at the operating units or at your subledgers, which you have at the operating units. Okay. So we can call the chart of accounts that you're seeing here, i.e. when you're entering that information, for example, the invoices, when you're entering the distribution account, the chart of accounts there is the transaction chart of accounts, by the fact that that is where you're entering your transactions. Okay. And the chart of accounts for your primary ledger is your accounting chart of accounts. The naming convention is different, but conceptually it's the same chart of accounts, right? Because we see the same thing, we see the same values. However, are there cases whereby these two chart of accounts can be different? Yes. Is there a case where transaction and accounting chart of accounts can be different? Yes. And that could happen in the case of secondary ledgers. Now, let's remind ourselves what secondary ledgers are. For one, we know that they are associated with your primary ledger. Of course, we create them as independent ledgers in a way, like we actually create a ledger, we specify some features, the features of a ledger that we need to specify the 4 C's, okay? But they are associated with your primary ledger, in that the secondary ledger is used to create a different, maybe reporting dimension for your transactions, okay? So how can a secondary ledger differ from your primary ledger? It can differ in terms of the chart of accounts that you are using, all right? So maybe the primary ledger has 7 segment chart of accounts, okay? And your secondary ledger, the chart of accounts will have maybe a different number of segments, 4 or 5, whichever number, okay? The other way that your secondary ledger can differ from your primary ledger is that they can have different subledger accounting methods. So maybe in our primary ledger, we want to have accrual accounting method, okay? Maybe as per maybe the government agency that regulates this. For example, the US, all right, the IRS requires that for your type of company, you need to use accrual method of reporting. However, within the company, your management also wants to keep a different type of accounting. Maybe they want to see this, want to use cash also. So they would create a secondary ledger and assign a different accounting method, so the cash accounting method. So that's some of the ways that these two ledgers can differ, all right? And those two ways, the chart of accounts and the sub-ledger accounting method, are the two things which are going to have an implication when we are talking about the differences between transaction and accounting chart of accounts. Now, if you have this kind of setup whereby you have the primary ledger and you have the secondary ledger, and by the way, you have to note that this is a sub-ledger level secondary ledger. You can create one at the journals level, whereby information there is sent by posting program, right? When you post something in your primary ledger, then that's when journals are sent to your secondary ledger and posted. But in the case of sub-ledger level, create accounting is the one that sends that accounting information to the secondary ledger. Okay, so when you have this kind of setup, you enter a transaction at your operating unit for whatever sub-ledger module. Let's take AP, for example. You have posted your transactions there, you have entered invoices, you have created payments, right? Maybe at a certain time, you create accounting for your transactions. When you create accounting, the create accounting program, which is owned by your SLA module, will create accounting and send that information to your ledgers, all right? When you do create accounting, you'll do it once, and create accounting will send accounting information. You'll do it once, and that information will be sent to your primary ledger, and it will also be sent to your secondary ledger. So it's not like you're creating accounting twice, once for your primary ledger and once for your secondary. You do it once, and then create accounting sends that information to your primary ledger, and it also sends that information to your secondary ledger. All right? Now, what have we said about this? About these two ledgers. One, they'll have different chart of accounts. Okay, so you can see here COA1 and COA2, and then they will also have different sub-ledger accounting methods. The primary ledger is using accrual, and the secondary ledger is using cash. Okay, so those are the features that you have associated with these two ledgers when you're setting them up. Now, when you create accounting, regardless of the difference between these two ledgers, create accounting will still send that accounting information from your operating units to your ledgers. Okay. So when you go to the SLA module and you're customizing the components of the SLA module, these components which we can customize, right? You can specify the chart of accounts, as we have seen, in those components. All right. So, for example, when you're customizing this subledger accounting method for your secondary ledger, all right. Remember, your secondary ledger also has a different chart of accounts to your primary ledger. So when you're customizing this particular component, then you can specify that particular chart of accounts for your secondary ledger, because remember that this is the subledger accounting method that you're going to associate with this particular secondary ledger. All right. So in that case, the transaction chart of account will be different from the accounting chart of accounts, all right? Because accounting in your secondary ledger is being represented in a different way as a consequence of having a different chart of accounts, all right? So the chart of accounts here is the same as the one for your primary ledger, because that is always the case when you associate because you associate your operating units with a particular primary ledger, right? So the chart of accounts between for the operating unit and the primary ledger will always be the same, but you'll have a different chart of accounts for your secondary ledger, all right? So when you're customizing this particular subledger accounting method, you can specify it for this particular chart of accounts, all right? Because anyway, that is the purpose why, that is the reason why you have this secondary ledger setup, right? You want to have a different way in which accounting is created for whatever purposes. So that is the case whereby the transaction and the accounting chart of accounts will be different. All right. So I hope that is clear. So you will associate this particular subledger accounting method, and also you will associate this particular subledger accounting method with your secondary ledger, and then you can specify that you can specify the chart of accounts for your secondary ledger in those components, and you can do it down, and you can do it at any level or for any of these components. But however, as we'll see, you cannot just do it haphazardly. You cannot do it, for example, for just the journal line definitions. Okay, that is something that we are going to look like. You have to either do it all the way from the top when you specify the chart of accounts ledger, all right, or you do it for a parent, and then whatever you attach to that parent, all right, then you don't have to specify. But for example, you cannot specify the particular transaction and chart of accounts for your journal line definitions, and then attach that journal line definition to an application accounting definition whereby you have not specified that those particular transaction and accounting chart of accounts. All right. So that is the difference between the transaction and accounting chart of accounts. Maybe we can go to the system, for example, and let's so when you come to your components, right, what we are saying is, remember we said, of course, we can't make changes to components that are owned by Oracle. All right. So in order to make changes, we have to clone this component, and then we can make modifications. All right. But for example, when you clone, let's see whether there's a clone here that doesn't have anything attached. All right. So this, I believe, is a clone of the standard accrual method. I'm not the one who did it, but it should work. Let's go to the application accounting definition for payables. Go back up. So payables, all right. If you go into the application accounting definition, you will have this. So this is a clone of the method. Remember, when you're cloning, you clone it at every level. All right. Go back up a bit. Don't know why this is refusing to scroll. Okay. So this is a clone of the accounting method. All right. So you can make changes in terms of the application accounting definitions that are attached here. All right, for each of these applications. Okay, but however, these applications are these application accounting definitions are still the ones that are owned by Oracle. All right, so you can make changes here, but if you go inside this application accounting definition, it's still the one that you need to. It's still the one that's owned by Oracle. However, it looks like this user already cloned his, so maybe they already made differences. They already made changes within these features. So this will be better when we are doing the changes ourselves in order to understand. But I do want to go into that right now. But for example, you can see that it says here that the owner of this is the user, all right, of this particular application accounting definition. But if you go inside this journal line definition, you see it still says that the owner is Oracle. So basically, you can attach a modified component. You can attach a modified component you can attach a seeded component to a component that you have modified, but not the other way around. Okay, because that basically means you're modifying the seeded component. All right, let me say that again. You cannot modify the seeded components that are owned by Oracle, which basically means you cannot attach a modified component, a clone that you have modified. You cannot go and attach it to that seeded component, but you can do it the other way around. All right, you can modify, for example, this subledger accounting method, all right, and then attach a modified, and then attach a seeded, all right. So this is a user owned. Then you can come and attach a seeded component to this particular subledger accounting method. All right. We've digressed a bit, so let's go back to actually what we were talking about. So what I wanted to head towards is that specifying this particular chart of accounts has implications to some of the things that you can do within subledger module in terms of modification. So these seeded components, we can think of them as what? As generic. All right. So it is, for example, a subledger accounting method that it will serve the purpose of many companies. All right, something like that, and therefore it is the logic, even the logic within them is created in that sense, in a way whereby regardless of the company that's using the setup, the logic within these components will allow that particular company to come up with reasonable accounting. But of course, we are able to make modifications to meet specific needs. But now when you specify a chart of accounts, then it becomes very specific to that particular setup based on that chart of accounts. So it's not something that you can go and for example, that's why we're saying we cannot just go and attach a modified component to a seeded parent, all right? Because now that component has become modified and specific to your particular setup. And some of the implications, for example, if we go deep, so application accounting definition, let's go to journal line definition, and let's go to, for example, item expense line type. All right, the line type is associated with an account derivation rule that tells it how it's going to obtain that particular account combination for that line. So if we go within the account derivation rule, the logic that is described here says that the source of the account comes from the invoice distribution account. All right. We have this field here that says value type, which says that the value that is going to be obtained here comes from a source document. The source document in this case being our invoice, and specifically the place where the invoice distribution account is entered, right? However, we may want, for example, for this account derivation rule to have a constant, right? To have a constant value. So regardless of what is entered in that invoice distribution account field, we don't want we are looking at item expense, right? We don't want that we don't want that account to be derived from that invoice distribution, all right? We want it to be a constant. Keep in mind, this is a seeded component owned by Oracle. So the way we would do that is by coming here and saying that we want our value type to be constant, okay? But if you click on this list that shows value type, we only have these two options: account derivation rule and source, all right? So basically, we don't have an option of entering a constant value, okay? How can you think of that? This, maybe you can think of this as a rule, account derivation rule, that you can attach to any line type, all right? That line type going all the way up to the subledger accounting method. Going back to our slide here. So we are making changes to the account derivation rule, how it is obtained, which is associated with a line type, right? So all the way up here, this will go to be attached to a ledger by attaching the subledger accounting method. We can attach this subledger accounting method to any ledger. If we can attach it to any ledger, it means that ledger can have any chart of accounts, right? So therefore, if this is something we can attach to any ledger and consequently any chart of accounts, right, then there's no way we can then go ahead and say that we want a constant value, that constant value being an account combination, all right? So what if that chart of accounts does not have the values in that combination, right? Does that make sense? So that is why nothing is specified here, all right? However, when you specify now the transaction and accounting chart of accounts, then you have the option of entering a constant value, all right? Because this is specific to that particular chart of accounts, and therefore the values for that account combination will be obtained from the values associated with that chart of accounts, all right? As a demonstration, for example, let us copy this account derivation rule. Or let's cancel, and let's try and create a new one. You can call this demonstration or demo, and this demo, all right? Now here we can attach chart of accounts, because one, this is a user owned, so we can make changes. So let's say we want Maskani All right, so let's choose Maskani. There's a lot of Maskani people are creating anyway. So that, so let's just specify the chart of accounts, right? Now, once you specify that, we can select flex field. Let's see, or segment. Actually, the other thing that you notice is that when you specify the chart of accounts, the segment options that you are provided with become the actual segments for your account, for your chart of accounts, right? So this is what we have called our segments: company, account, division, department, and all that. All right. So let's say, for instance, we are creating. Let's not specify. Let's just say that this rule is for the whole flex field instead of obtaining a segment. So let's cancel that flex field. Let's see. Let's save this. So now you see when you come here, then you have this option of constant, right? Because this is specific to this particular chart of account. Therefore, specifying a constant value makes sense, right? Specifying a constant value makes sense, which you can then go ahead and specify here in this field. But before, when it was not associated with any chart of accounts, then it doesn't make sense, because basically the way the logic is defined is that it can be used to derive values for any setup and consequently any chart of accounts, and those chart of accounts might have different COA and hence different types of combinations, right? So those are some of the implications of specifying the transaction and the accounting chart of accounts. So I'm just going to delete that. I did that for the demonstration. We are going to go ahead and create our components as we go on that we are going to use for demonstration. I just did that to show you the implications of specifying the chart of accounts. So in that case, that is the reason why, of course, these seeded components, they don't have anything specified, at the transaction and the accounting chart of accounts field. So what have we learned? We have learned the difference between transaction and accounting chart of accounts. As far as our primary ledger is concerned, those two are conceptually the same thing. It's just that the one that on the ledger side, it is referred to as an accounting chart of accounts, because we can think of that is the purpose of general ledger. But on the operating unit side or the sub-ledger module side, it is referred to as a transaction chart of accounts. When we're talking about the primary ledger, those will have to be the same, all right? But when we're talking about secondary ledger, which has a separate or a different chart of accounts, then they can become different, They can be different chart of accounts, and you can come and specify that in this field. The other thing that we have learned is that once you specify this chart of accounts for a particular component, you either specify the whole chain, all right, all the way now from the top, from your subledger accounting method, all right. You specify everything. If you want to specify something down here, if you want to specify chart of accounts for a component that's downstream, then the parent also has to have that specification, and if that parent has that specification, then it means each parent has to have that specification. Okay, so when you specify something downstream, then everything else has to have that same specification. So it's that or nothing has that specification at all, or you can have it that it is specified here at the top, all right, but then you attach components downstream which are not specified. Okay, so the three legal options are that first one is nothing is specified for any of them, all right, or everything is specified for all of them, or only the topmost, okay, is specified. Then you can go ahead and attach other components which are generic. So I understand that that was a bit theoretical, and we are going to see the practical implications in our next session. Anyway, that's what I had planned for this session. Bob, unless you have something to add, we can stop there.
Thank you.